Well, just to introduce kind of where we are, we have been working through Genesis. That's kind of a misnomer maybe, but we are in Genesis. We have been there. And then we came to Genesis 2, 1-3, where we have the Lord's seventh day rest. We considered what that meant, and then that launched us into study on Sabbath, because it's such a huge theme in the Bible. The Bible picks it up again and again as a tool to kind of explain to us what God intends to do in redemption, what He's going to provide for us. And then also we picked it up because it's really a matter of controversy among Christians. And so we want to have a position on this and be informed as well. In that series, we are now at the place where we've gone through, we've taught all of this, and I intended to do just one message. It's turned into two, where we consider some common objections to what our understanding of the Sabbath commandment is. And so we're on that second message. And what I want to do to begin today is to restate again, just as in as abbreviated a way as I can, I think the general totality of that position. I did this last week as well. Just take a few minutes. And then I will review briefly the objection that we considered last week, because it's kind of a longer one. We'll briefly review that and then dive into the things that remain. Let me just remind you again, I don't intend to argue for the position I feel like I already have argued. We're just talking about objections and giving a response to those from the Scriptures. And so that's where we are. That's what we'll do. So let me just begin then by stating the position as it was taught. Our position has been that the first seventh day rest was God's rest of satisfaction, of joy. There was fellowship between God and man, and there was a special consecration that happened on that day of everything that God made unto God. Right? Remember, He made it all. At the end of the sixth day, the text tells us he was done. Everything was done. Everything was made. Then on the seventh day, it says He finished, and He rested, and He consecrated what He had made unto Himself. And so this Sabbath, this day of rest that God had, was a day where He, in some special way, took everything that He had made and oriented it all to Himself. He consecrated it in a special way to Himself. This is the intended end of God's creation, right? At the end of creation week, everything was not done until the seventh day, when it was especially put into relationship with Him, particularly when everything in this world was under man, and then man was in right relationship with God. That's what God wanted. This was to be this way forever. It did not go on forever, though, because sin entered and destroyed man's participation in God's rest. It also destroyed this whole aspect of not only of man's participation in God's rest, but this whole aspect of God's rest. This idea that God's plan was to have man in His image, ruling in the world, multiplying, being a blessing throughout all the world, increasing the knowledge of God through the world, all while in perfect relationship with man. That was undone. God's plan was undone and frustrated and destroyed, and looked like it would never be made right. Only God could set it right. And He does that through Christ, who was promised in various ways before He came to bless the world and bring mankind back to faith in God. God made a special promise to Abraham and to a seed that would one day come from his descendants. That promise was what? That God would bring these blessings of His rest back to man. That one day that would come to the world through a descendant of Abraham. God later entered into covenant with the physical descendants of Abraham to preserve them and to teach them and to prepare them for the fulfillment of His promises for the world through one of their descendants one day. God had great promises and intentions, great blessings He wanted to give to the world, and He preserved a people. He made a promise to Abraham, it's going to be through one of your descendants. Then He made a covenant to His descendants to preserve them and to prepare them for what God was going to do through that seed who would come one day. Now the sign of that covenant, that preserving, preparing covenant, was the Sabbath commandment. The Sabbath commandment, we said, was first given to the people of Israel at Mount Sinai. It had never been given before. Though the people were prepared for it through the beginning of their manna experience in the wilderness, right? They had a calendar like everyone else did back then. It was a 10-day calendar. And then God gave them the manna, and through the process of how He fed them the manna, He taught them 6 days of work and 1 day of rest. He began to train them on a 7-day week cycle, and then came the Sabbath commandment. How God wanted them to keep that 7th day as a special sign between Him and them. The people of Israel, though, were not faithful to this covenant. They broke Sabbath again and again. They failed to pass along its blessings to each other. They failed to enjoy it themselves. They turned aside to false gods. The prophets continually call people back to faithfulness. They speak of a time when God will turn the hearts of the people to God, and when they will keep all of God's laws, and when a promised one would finally come and restore true rest back to God's people. Christ comes later as the fulfillment of all these promises and as the substance of all these shadows. Once Christ comes and brings this blessing with Him, our position was then that the shadowy laws and institutions that were part of the covenant with Israel are done away with and are no longer binding on God's people. The blessing is brought to us by Christ in fullness. The Sabbath blessing. He brings it to us in fullness. The Sabbath commandment that existed for the Old Covenant only ever brought those blessings in dim measure. If you were an Israelite, you had 1 day in 7 where God was going to so provide for you, you didn't have to do any work, and you could just concentrate on your relationship to God, His love to you. You can thank Him for all that He's done and enjoy communion with God. But that is a dim measure, a small measure of the blessing that Christ brings, which is far greater. But some Christians have felt a special benefit from embracing at least some of the Sabbath practices that were given to Israel, and they're free to do so. It's fine for them to do so. It may, in fact, actually be a help for them to do so. That's generally, in a whole, been our position. It's certainly in summary form, but that's kind of where we've come. Now then, just briefly review this objection we considered last time and our answer. The objection was that the Sabbath is an unchanging moral law of God, right? You hear that all the time. Well, the Sabbath is an unchanging moral law of God. And there are generally 3 arguments given for support. The first is that the Sabbath was a creation ordinance. The second, that it's one of the 10 commandments. And the third, that the prophets spoke of a future day of God's blessing, and the way they spoke of it was oftentimes as though they spoke of it in a way that people in that future day will be keeping Sabbath. So you have kind of 3 arguments that says, this seems like this is going to go on forever. Why would it change? So briefly, our argument against these 3 points was fairly succinct. Again, remember, I'm not trying to make a full case in these 2 messages for our position of the Sabbath. That's already been done. I'm just trying to deal with common objections that come up and showing an answer. So briefly reviewing, what was our argument about the creation ordinance? That objection comes in this way. It says essentially that the Sabbath was given to mankind at His creation and has been a duty upon him throughout all of his existence. And it will always remain a duty. It was a creation ordinance. Now the text they turn to is Genesis chapter 2, 1-3. What we saw from Genesis 2, 1-3 is in fact, though they usually turn there is 0 mention at all of any duty upon mankind in that text. It is simply, just like everything else in the Genesis 1 creation account, it is simply a description of God's activity, of what God did. It has nothing to do with what man has done. The other passage they often turn to is Exodus 20, there where the 10 Commandments are given. people latch onto this word there. It says, remember the Sabbath. And they say, well, see, remember. How can they remember something they didn't know? And of course, we just said on that that's not the way speech works. You oftentimes will tell someone when you're give them a commandment you want them to keep in the future, you'll say, now, I'm going to tell you something, and I want you to remember this from now on. And that's just the way you talk. There's no need to assume a prior experience with the Sabbath. But our other argument was, even if you do say remember has to require some kind of experience that they've had with the Sabbath, they obtained that experience in the wilderness with the manna as they began to learn about a 7-day cycle that God had them teaching, or had them living. And so they would have just been remembering their last month of experience, not universal human practice from Adam. So quite a difference. Now then, the second thing they say is that it's one of the 10 Commandments. Now this part of the objection insists that because the 10 Commandments were written in stone by the very finger of God, they are necessarily permanent and cannot be changed. You'll hear people say, you say the Sabbath changed, but you need to understand that was one of the 10 Commandments. Written by God's finger in stone. That just screams permanency. But I just have to remind them of the biblical account. Those permanent tablets lasted all of about a day. Not even, Moses didn't even get all the way down the mountain and they were destroyed. And what happened later is Moses recorded it the next time. So much for permanency. That's just one quick thing. Another one is, if this is the unchanging moral law of God, most Sabbatarians are saying that it did change. It changed from the 7th day to the 1st day. So they also have to explain a change in the law. But more directly to the point, that's just kind of almost tongue-in-cheek, but more directly to the point is this objection, I think, has to do with a misunderstanding of the 10 Commandments themselves. If you say, well, the Sabbath has to be binding on us because it was one of the 10 Commandments, it's likely that you misunderstand the 10 Commandments. They are a foundational document of the covenant between God and Israel. We saw that again and again. The 10 Commandments are said to be the covenant. The ark, that box, becomes the ark of the covenant once the tablets of the covenant get inserted into it. It is the covenant. We saw so many texts that showed that. This is the covenant itself. They are the covenant arrangement itself with all the rest of the laws built off of them, kind of like a constitution in our country. Paul spoke also, this is another line of argument on this, is they say, well, it was written by God's finger in tablets of stone. Paul uses that same language, engraved in stone, in 2 Corinthians 3, and the way he talks about it was a ministry of death and of condemnation. And its time has passed and something new has come. And Paul doesn't say, that old covenant that Moses, gave the people of Israel. He says, those 10 Commandments written on those tablets of stone, that's a ministry of death, and we're not under that anymore. We're under a new kind of ministry, namely a ministry of life, ministered by the Spirit, ministry of righteousness. So we're not under that. We also saw from Exodus 31 that the Sabbath was a sign of the covenant. And as a sign, I just talked a little bit about what a sign is. Necessarily, a sign is unique. A sign functions, imagine if every street you ever drove on had a one-way sign on it. And when you got to the one-way street and you saw the one-way sign, how does that signify anything different to you than every other one-way sign? How do you know this one's different? The Sabbath was given to the people of Israel as a unique and special sign between them and God of this particular covenant. Right? I used the example also last week of, if everyone wore wedding rings, if every person had a wedding ring, well, you wouldn't call it a wedding ring anymore. You just would say, it's just people in our culture wear these rings. It wouldn't signify anything special between my wife and I if everyone had one of these. Signs work specifically because they're unique, because they stand out, because they're distinct. And when God gave the Sabbath, the fact that the Sabbath itself is the sign of the old covenant tells you right off that it's peculiar to the people of Israel and not universally binding on all men, because it was a peculiar, unique sign between God and the people of Israel. As such, in that Exodus 31, God says, he says, above all, when he gives this command, he says, above all the things I've commanded you, this is the most important, keep the Sabbath. And that sounds crazy to us, because even people that would say the Sabbath is one of the Ten Commandments, it's kind of on the second tier of the Ten Commandments. It's there, but it's not the same as not killing or something. That's not this, or having a false god. That would be worse in their mind. But God says, above everything else, keep the Sabbath. And the reason is because the Sabbath functions as a sign of the Old Covenant. It is at one time, during the covenant, it is the most important of all the commandments in terms of which ones you're required to keep. In that sense, it's not the greatest commandment. That is, Jesus says, to love God. But your love for God, God says, your love for me should above all be expressed in this, keeping Sabbath. At the same time, it is also the most transitory and the most impermanent, because it has to do, and the most temporary, because it is a sign of this covenant. And once that covenant goes away, during the covenant, it was the sign. It was like wearing your wedding ring or not wearing it. Am I going to refuse to wear this thing? Am I going to give it back to my spouse and say no more? Or am I going to wear it? You'd better have it on. It's the most important thing. It signifies the whole relationship. But if your spouse dies, that is the least important thing about your relationship and about your life going on, this ring. You might have a whole lifetime of experience and memories with that spouse who's no longer with you, but the ring itself is no longer anything. And this is the way it is with the Sabbath. It's gone. It's over. It's the least permanent of the Ten Commandments because it was the sign. Now the prophets spoke of a future day. This is another objection. Well, those prophets, they talk about a future day in which God's people were going to keep the Sabbath. Now, in this instance, the argument is usually made simply from the fact that Isaiah and Ezekiel both speak of the time of the New Covenant blessing as the time in which people from all over the world will join themselves to God and will keep Sabbath. Obey His word, keep His Sabbath. Now, because we are talking about the Sabbath specifically, we confined ourselves just to this issue, even though we're dealing with a larger theological concept here. And the idea is this. The larger theological concept is this, and the disagreement and the debate that happens between large schools of thought in theology is these promises we find in the Old Covenant. When we see the New Testament says they're fulfilled, do we take the New Testament at its word and say this is that? Or do we say, well, not really. This is maybe some kind of that, but we're still waiting for the actual fulfillment of what was promised. In other words, if God promised the people a land, well, it's not enough, that the New Testament says that will be fulfilled in a certain way. When we read our Old Testament, we read it different, so the New Testament has to be wrong or give an incomplete picture. We're waiting for more. And so there's this whole debate back and forth. And I don't want to get into all that, but I just would say this. As we confine ourselves to the Sabbath, that the Sabbath itself, those texts in Isaiah and Ezekiel don't mention a single kind of Sabbath. They're not talking about the Sabbath only of the Ten Commandments, but of all of the Sabbaths in the Old Covenant. And if you wonder what all those Sabbaths are, it's explained and described in Leviticus 23, where God says, these are all my Sabbaths that they're required to keep as signs. And it mentions the seventh-day Sabbath, and it mentions all these other festivals that they keep. All of them are Sabbaths. Now, all of those Sabbaths, Isaiah and Ezekiel say, are going to be kept by you. And I would just say, if you say, well, I'm going to keep that seventh-day Sabbath, and I'm going to point to those texts as to why, you better be keeping all the feasts and everything else as well. It's quite a thing. But the problem with doing that is the New Testament gives clear and explicit teaching about what Christians are to do with regard to Sabbaths. Paul says in Colossians 2, that all of those Sabbaths were a shadow of what Christ came to bring, and you're not to allow anyone to require you to keep them. So it's a big problem if we're going to say that the Sabbath is required of of us based on those texts, because those texts in Isaiah talk about all the Sabbaths, and the New Testament says all those Sabbaths were a mere shadow. Every Christian is now under obligation to not let other people require them to observe Sabbaths anymore. You're free to keep them, but you are required, you're under obligation by Paul not to let anyone disqualify you simply because you don't keep those Sabbaths. What a thing. We have the substantive blessing that the prophets were speaking of, and our lives demonstrate the obedience the prophets spoke about in spirit and in truth. That's quite a thing. And the prophets say, look, one day people are going to come back and they're going to keep all of God's laws and they're going to love them. And God's going to be their God. They're going to be His people. They'll obey Him. They'll serve Him with a whole heart. They'll keep all of His commandments. They're going to call the Sabbath a delight. And we get to the New Testament and it says, well, we're not keeping the Sabbath anymore. And you think, well, what do you mean? Well, look, what was really talked about in those prophecies? It was the reality and the substance of this relationship being brought back to God, and the obedience and the fellowship and the joy and the unity that was there. And that's what Christ brings. Now all that's review to that objection. Now objection number 2. This one's the longest of the ones we'll look at today. People will say, well, Jesus must have kept the Sabbath because He was born under the law. Right? If Jesus was born under the law, then He had to keep the Sabbath. So how can we say, as I said in the series, that Jesus had broken the Sabbath? How do we do that? Well, let's look at Galatians 4, where this text is found. Galatians 4, this is where the objection comes from. I told you it'd be a while before we got there. Galatians chapter 4, verse 4 says, "But when the fullness of time had come, God sent forth His Son, born of woman, born under the law, to redeem those who were under the law, so that we might receive adoption as sons." Now what I want you to notice is between verses 4 and 5, there is a causal connection. Look at verse 4. When the fullness of time had come, so when a certain time came, what did God do? He sent forth His Son, who was born of a woman and born under the law. For what purpose? In order to redeem those who were under the law, so that we might receive adoption as sons. So there's a causal connection. You see that? He had to be born of a woman. It had to be the Son of God who was born of a woman and born under the law in order to redeem those who were under the law, that we might receive the adoption as sons. Now, the question is, what is that causal connection between His being born under the law and redeeming those who are under the law? Well, those who raise this objection often say it was the need for a worked out legal righteousness under the Mosaic law, right? We needed someone to come under the Mosaic law and obey the Mosaic law perfectly to redeem those who are under that law out from under it. That's the argument. Now, first of all, and I don't mean to get into all this, but I just would say, full disclosure, I disagree with that concept of righteousness. I'm certainly not the first to do so. There's a long history of people who have, but I do. But really that's kind of beside the point. My answer here is this. It was to fulfill the promises that the seed would come as a descendant of Abraham to bless his family and even all the world. Jesus would be born into that circumstance as a brother of the people in order to bring them out of those circumstances and into another. Think of Moses, who was born a slave in Egypt. Now, he didn't grow up that way, but he was born a slave. He later grew up, he chose to identify with his own people, and that ultimately is how they were redeemed. He was born into the same situation they were, but he was so situated because of who he was and the way God used him that he was able to deliver them out from one circumstance into something else. Now look, this is the same way it is with Christ. God promised that He's going to send a seed of Abraham, right, who was going to bless the people. Now Paul says, look, Paul's here arguing with people who are thinking about going back to Mosaic commandments, and he says, no, look, you need to understand that law he's been telling us was just put in as a pedagogue, as a child trainer, as a child instructor to get the people of Israel, to preserve them until Christ would come. Now that He's come, what did He come to do? He actually came to buy us back and deliver us out of this situation where we were under all these laws and rules, and to bring us into something else. Now I would ask you, how would He do that? Well, He did it through the cross. My answer is that Jesus Christ cannot take the descendants of Abraham out of slavery to Moses and bring them into adoption as sons. He can't do that if He's not one of their brothers. He's got to be born of them, born under the law, to redeem those who are under the law. Because they're the people that God said it was through them this would happen. The whole context of the letter indicates this. The law came in, Paul says, it did not annul that previous covenant God made with Abraham. It didn't change a thing. God was all along, what was the plan? God said, one day I'm going to send a deliverer who will bless the people. The people of the descendants of Abraham will be blessed, and all the world through them. In order to get there, God brought this law in, this law covenant, and He used it to preserve and to teach the people and to set them apart for Himself in some way. And then eventually from them would come the one, now it's time, now it's time. Well, if this one who was going to come and bring these blessings doesn't come from them, they're just stuck in this covenant. It's got to be the sin of Abraham who frees them from this. It was put in. You remember here, it says, verse 19 of chapter 3. Why then the law? It was added because of transgressions, until the offspring should come to whom the promises had been made. Right? And it was put in place through angels by an intermediary. And he just goes on. Nowhere does he say, the law was fulfilled, we don't have to keep it anymore because Jesus obeyed it for you. That's not his point here. If that's your theological position, I'm not going to take issue with it here. I'm just saying that's not Paul's point here. What he says is the law, God just brought the law in because of transgressions, and He did it, and His intention was to just do it until the offspring should come, and then He was done with it. Now, Jesus was born under that law so that those people could be taken out of that situation and redeemed and brought into something else. If God gave the people of Israel this law and then did something with Christ over here on the other side of the world, these people are just stuck under this law that God gave them. But the Son of God came, born of a woman, born under the law, to lead them out of that into something else. And so I don't think you need anything other than just the context that's given. It was the plan of God to work it that way. Another text here that I would point to is John chapter 5, verse 18. John chapter 5 and verse 18. This was why the Jews were seeking all the more to kill Him. Because not only was He breaking the Sabbath, but He was even calling God His own Father, making Himself equal with God. Look, Jesus did in fact break the Sabbath. It says it right there. He broke the Sabbath. And you say, well, that can't, you're saying you're imputing Him with sin. I'm not. What I'm saying is, He broke the Sabbath commandment. As written, He broke the Sabbath commandment. The question is, was it still in force? And we had seen that it was not still in force. That in fact, Jesus Himself says, the law and the prophets all prophesied until John. And from that time on, the kingdom of heaven is advancing powerfully. He's ushering it in, and He spends all His time saying, the time of Moses is over. Come to me. Come to me. Come to me. And Anyway, but here He is breaking the Sabbath. Now, people will object to this. Now, this is funny. If I were to talk to like a Jehovah's Witness or something, and I'd say, well, Jesus is God, and they'd say, well, no, he's not. He's not God himself. He's something lesser than that. He was an angel. I would turn to this text, and I would say, look, it says because they were trying to kill him, because not only was he breaking the Sabbath, but he was even calling God his own Father, making himself equal with God. I point to that text, and they object, no, that's just what the people said. That's what they thought was happening. That's not what was actually happening. Of course, that doesn't pass with any Trinitarian Christian. They say, no, that's ridiculous. That's what the text says. But now let me turn it around. If I tell people who say, when Jesus kept the Sabbath all of his life, and I say, he was breaking the Sabbath, and they'll say, well, no, that's just what they thought. No, that's not. Moreover, I don't have to stop just there. I can go back into the verse. Verse 17, the verse before, Jesus answered them, my Father is working until now, and I am working on the Sabbath. You see, he's saying, and so they turn and say he is breaking the Sabbath, and he's saying that he's equal with God. He's saying that he's working like his Father is working. They take from that, he's admitting that he's breaking the Sabbath, and he's trying to tell us that he's actually equal with God. And both are true. He meant both things. They sought to stone him because he was breaking the Sabbath and calling God his Father. So the real question about this violation of the Sabbath law is not whether or not he violated it, but whether or not it was in effect at the time. And I don't believe that it was. I mean, we all know certain laws that are no longer on the books. And if you break that law, we don't actually count it as breaking the law. We could say, well, if that law had been in effect, you'd be a lawbreaker. But it's not in effect. So you didn't break the law. But people have to deal with these texts where Jesus says, I'm working on the Sabbath, and where when people say he's breaking the Sabbath, and he doesn't correct them. Anybody accuses Jesus of breaking the Sabbath, he never says, well, this isn't technically breaking the Sabbath. He just says, look, do you realize what I'm doing here? Do you realize that the blessing that I'm providing this person so far excels the Sabbath commandment? I've come to actually bring what the Sabbath was talking about. Do you know who I am? I'm Lord of this whole institution. He never just says, oh, actually, that's not quite what Moses meant there. It's quite a thing. Matthew 23. Matthew 23. Here's another objection. People will say again, but Jesus lived his whole life under that old covenant law of Moses, and when people came, look at this, Matthew 23, I want you to see this, and I'll explain the objection here. Then Jesus said to the crowds and to his disciples, the scribes and the Pharisees sit on Moses' seat, so practice and observe whatever they tell you, but not what they do, for they preach but do not practice. This is towards the end of Christ's ministry. And if I'm saying that Jesus was saying, well, that time of the old covenant is done away with and we're doing something different now, for Jesus towards the end of his ministry to be saying, listen, the scribes and Pharisees sit on Moses' seat, so you need to practice and do whatever they tell you, sounds like Jesus is affirming the Mosaic law and not doing away with it. Sounds like he's saying, disciples, keep obeying what Moses has written because it came from Moses. And you need to obey it, even if it comes from the scribes and the Pharisees. Now, I just say when you look at the context, he's not instructing people to continue keeping Moses for now. He's not doing that. He's telling them that his opposition to the scribes and Pharisees is not opposition to Moses' revelation. What do I mean? He's not, just like what he says earlier, don't think that I've come to abolish the law and commandments. I'm teaching new things, I'm teaching different things, I'm teaching things that you maybe didn't understand were there all the time. I'm the fulfillment of these things, but don't think I've just come to destroy them. Similarly, here he is blasting the scribes and Pharisees. But before he does, he says, now listen, I don't want you to think that everything that these guys say, everything that comes out of their mouth is wrong. Because even though they are wrong and they twist the Scriptures constantly, they are in fact opening the Scriptures. So don't just write them off. Listen to what they're saying, but don't you dare follow them. It's a curious statement that he makes. He says, so practice and observe whatever they tell you, but not what they do. And you think, oh, well, okay, so anything they say we're just supposed to do? And if you were to take it that way, you'd be wrong, because look what he just turns right around and says, for they preach but do not practice. You say, okay, they tie up heavy burdens hard to bear and lay them on people's shoulders, but they themselves are not willing to move them with their finger. There's one thing. Verse 13, woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites! You shut the kingdom of heaven in people's faces, for you neither enter yourselves nor allow those who would enter to go in. If you're following everything they teach you, that's not going to work. You're going to be barred from the kingdom as well. If you become a disciple of theirs, that's not going to work. You can't be like them. So here they are, they take the scriptures and twist them, but what he's saying is you need to listen to them and sift through what they're saying. Don't write off Moses just because these guys are twisting him and doing what they're doing. But that doesn't change his message. He's still not saying keep Moses. He's saying listen carefully. Observe what Moses has said. And here what he means is, if you take it in the context of the rest of his ministry, he says again and again, if you would listen to Moses, he wrote of me, come to me. You think you got to keep the commandments and you're going to get life that way. That's not it. Moses was writing of me. Moses was telling of me. Moses said, look, there's one coming who you need to listen to. That's the one you've got to listen to, and I'm here. And then here Jesus says, I'm getting ready to lambaste these guys, and I want you to know I'm not against Moses. They said it's a good place, the seat of Moses. You should listen carefully to the words that they speak, but don't be a twofold child of hell like they are. That's my answer there. It's just that it doesn't require that. Now, here's another one they'll say. The Sabbath was made for man. The Sabbath was made for man. And at this point, they might, the objector would just kind of say this, look, whatever other arguments you have against keeping the Sabbath, there's this trump card in this sense. They'd say, the Bible says the Sabbath was made for man. So why wouldn't man keep it? Why wouldn't man always keep it? The Sabbath was made for man. It must be a blessing for him then. It's a good thing to do. It's a blessing. We should keep it. Shouldn't not keep it. And we can just turn to Mark chapter 2, verse 27, where that's found. This is the text where that objection comes. Mark 2, verse 27, and he said to them, the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. So man was not made for the Sabbath. What does that mean? What does that mean? Man was not made for the Sabbath. Well, the way I explained it before is this. When God created man, He didn't have the Sabbath in mind and then make man in such a way that He would keep it. Right? Man was not made for the Sabbath. Just the opposite. God had man. He had something He intended for man to receive and have. The Sabbath was made for man to help man get what God wanted him to have. Now, as such, it was a temporary law given to the people of Israel for a period of time. Once the Son of Man came, He brought the full blessing that God intended for them to get. The Sabbath was a tool to help them get the blessing. Man was not made for the Sabbath, rather, the Sabbath was made for man. Now, I can confirm that understanding by the next verse. Let's look at verse 27 again. And He said to them, the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath, so the Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath. If the Sabbath is something that God wants all men everywhere to keep, the Son of Man is not Lord of it in such a way as to do what He wants with it. The Son of Man who comes as a divine figure to rescue men, to put men back in relationship with God, into restored fellowship with God, would not be free to change the terms of how God wants them to live. He's there to enable them to live the way God wants them to live, not to live a different way. So here is Jesus, and He's over there doing things that people are saying are breaking the Sabbath, and He says, look, His defense is, look, this thing was brought in to be a blessing to people. not to rule over. This is not some eternal thing that men are always to keep forever. It was a tool to get men to a blessing. And I'm that blessing. I'm the one who's come to provide everything that God is. I'm the substantive blessing of which the Sabbath was a shadow. I'm here. And as the Son of Man, I'm Lord of it. And I'll do what I want with it. Jesus is saying that His breaking the Sabbath is okay because He's the Son of Man. And as such, He's the one who brings to people a greater Sabbath blessing than keeping Old Covenant Sabbath laws ever brought them. He's also implying that God approves of His handling of it in this way because God has made Him Lord over it to do with it what He wishes. The Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath. Notice that. I mean, it doesn't say the Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath. It says the Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath. The reason the Son of Man is Lord even over the Sabbath is because the Sabbath itself is not something man was made for. See, if it was the other way around, that man was made for the Sabbath, then the Son of Man would not be Lord over it in this sense. You see the argument. I mean, it's a connection here. The Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. And because that is true, the Son of Man then is Lord even over that. The idea is the Son of Man is Lord over everything that was made for man to bring blessing to man, to bring man back in relationship to God. As the one who will lead the charge and accomplish that task in reality, namely the Son of Man, every tool that God used in history to help men get there is at His disposal. And He will do with them what He wants because as the Son of Man, He's the great Lord who will bring humanity back into this relationship. And what He says in the verse before is that the Sabbath is one of those tools. Man was not made for the Sabbath, rather the Sabbath was made for man. And so as the Son of Man, He's Lord over it. Even that Sabbath, which they regarded so highly, even that most important of all Old Covenant laws, He can do with it whatsoever He wishes, if in doing so, He provides the true blessing that He's meant to provide. And this is what He does. He could have chosen differently. He could have chosen to keep it. He could have said, look, I think this will be a continual blessing for you, and I want all of my disciples to keep it. Instead, He left us free to do that if we want or not do that. And as the Lord of the Sabbath, that's what He's done. There's one more argument, and we'll be done. And that is from Hebrews 4. Another common phrase you'll hear. People will say, well, the Bible says there remains a Sabbath rest for the people of God. I hear that all the time. This is ripped right out of context. Right? They just read it and say Hebrews chapter 4, verse 9. So then, there remains a Sabbath rest for the people of God. I have heard that scripture used so many times when talking to Sabbatarians. They'll say, well, God says there remains a Sabbath rest for the people of God, so we keep Sabbath rest. And I just want to scream, like, look at the context. The Sabbath rest that he's talking about, it's the kind of rest the people of Israel did not get for entering into the land. He's not talking about the Sabbath rest that they were keeping every 7 days. They kept that. They were keeping that at this time. But they didn't get into the promised land of rest. Chapter 3. Therefore, as verse 7, as the Holy Spirit says, today if you hear His voice, do not harden your hearts as in the rebellion on the day of testing in the wilderness, when your fathers put me to the test and saw my works for 40 years. Therefore I was provoked with that generation and said, they always go astray in their heart. They have not known my ways. As I swore in my wrath, they shall not enter my rest. Right? The people of Israel disbelieved the promises. The spies came back and with a bad report said, we can't take the land. God's not going to be with us. It's not going to work. And God swore in His wrath, they're not going to enter His rest. And they did, and they all died out there in the wilderness. The rest that's described in that text is what? It's rest in the land. Now, as David applies it to his audience, today if you hear His voice, don't harden your hearts like they did, because you don't want to lose out on this rest either. David has in mind a rest that even his contemporaries could into. They had the land. Joshua had provided the land. And the author to the Hebrews says, look, that's not what David's talking about. It's not the rest that Joshua provided. There's some other rest that you can have if you will believe God and not harden your hearts and trust God and follow God and live for God. If you'll do that, you can have rest. Now the author to the Hebrews looks at these people who have been believers, and some are beginning to sway and turn away from the faith. And he says, don't turn away. You need to press on, continue all the way to the end, so that you also might obtain the rest that God has in store for you. To take that verse then and say, well, see, we got to keep the seventh-day Sabbath, is to miss the point. It's just not it's a very poor reading of the text. Look at chapter 4, verse 1. Therefore, while the promise of entering His rest still stands, right? It stands for us. Let us fear, lest any of you should seem to have failed to reach it. For good news came to us just as to them, but the message that they heard did not benefit them, because those words were not united by faith with those who listened. For we who have believed enter that rest. As He has said, as I swore in my wrath, they shall not enter my rest. You see, when you believe in Christ, the wrath of God no longer abides in you. So if you've believed, you know you've entered into God's rest, because when God keeps people from His rest, He says, I swore in my wrath, they're not going to enter my rest. We who have believed have entered my rest, as God has said, as I swore in my wrath, they shall not enter my rest. Although His works were finished from the foundation of the world. For He has somewhere spoken of the seventh day in this way, and God rested on the seventh day from all His works. And again, then in this passage, in the Psalms that he's quoting from David, he said, they shall not enter my rest. And he just tells us, look, therefore it remains for some to enter it. And those who formerly received the good news, the people of Israel, failed to enter because of disobedience. Again, He appoints a certain day, today, saying through David so long afterward, and the words already quoted, today if you hear His voice, do not harden your hearts. For if Joshua had given them rest, God would not have spoken of another day later on. So then there remains a Sabbath rest for the people of God. For whoever has entered God's rest has also rested from his works, as God did from His. Let us therefore strive to enter that rest, so that no one may fall by the same sort of disobedience. So what's he saying? Look, when he says, so then there remains a Sabbath rest for the people of God, all he's saying is God has more out there. There's more. There's more fullness. There's more blessing. There's more of a relationship. There's more rest that God has for you, more blessing that He intends for you. There's more of it that's out there, and we need to strive to enter into that. Don't turn back. Are you believing God? Are you following God? Are you going hard for God? Or are those promises just kind of far off and you're forgetting about them and not living for them? Are you near to falling away? Strive to enter this rest. There are other times in history where people went on with God for a while and fell through disobedience and got nothing. Right? They heard the word. Remember, God says, I'm come to deliver you out of the land of Egypt, out of slavery, into a land flowing with milk and honey. It's going to go well for you. I'm going to be your God. God said that to them, and it did them no good. They died in the wilderness under the wrath of God because they didn't believe. They didn't press on. So He says, you need to strive. This text is not saying anything at all about keeping a seventh-day Sabbath rest. It just doesn't mean that at all. Now, just in conclusion here, again, it's not really the kind of message I normally would do at all, but just to say once again, we've not been trying to positively set forward a case. We're just dealing with the main texts that come up as objections and showing that there is a perfectly consistent way to understand those texts with what we've been saying all along. It's not surprising that we turn to these texts because, in fact, I feel like most of these texts actually do argue for the position we've given. You know, in our series so far, we have turned to almost all of these texts that we've read today. The fact that these are the texts that the other side points to as their text, And all I have to do is just explain plainly what's in the context and what they mean, and it nearly proves this other position, I think, is quite a statement about the relative strengths of the positions. But nonetheless, that's where we are. Those were the objections as I see it. I don't see really other objections that are brought up unless you're dealing with groups like, Seventh-day Adventists and things like that. And you may deal with those people, but that's certainly a different argument that they make than normal evangelical Sabbatarians. Again, this whole series is not to be partisan. It's not to try to, make us rigid in that sense. I mean, we want to let Christians practice what they want to practice in the freedom of their conscience. But I want you to know what the Bible's position is on this, how redemptive history works and flows. The Sabbath comes up constantly in Scripture. It's all over in the Gospels. It's several times. You see it several times in the rest of the New Testament. Its imagery is everywhere. I think you have a richer understanding of the Bible and richer reading of the Bible if you have a good understanding of the Sabbath and the way it's used. Are there questions or comments about any of these texts we looked at today, or anything that I've said at all? Happy to deal with if there are.